Good morning, everybody. This is a live extreme weather briefing on the severe weather threat along a warm frontal zone that's going to be lifting north through central Florida. It's actually approaching the Tampa Bay area right now this morning, and eventually supercells are forecast to make landfall probably near the Crystal River area by about 6 p.m., right around sunset, and then that threat of supercells is going to continue east across central and northern Florida along that warm frontal zone through the night tonight, and the trigger mechanism for this supercell event is a subtle speed max or just a little bit of a divot in those mid-level height contours that's associated with a jet streak, a ribbon of vorticity that is going to be generating a band of supercell storms. And if that warm front can lift up northward and then meet up with that convection as it makes landfall, there definitely is going to be a tornado threat through this evening. Beginning at about 6 p.m. in the circled area here, the pink zone. This is my target area. This is that band of supercells that is forecast to approach the Crystal River area, which is right about in this gap here in the Florida Peninsula. And right now, the warm frontal zone is lifting northward through central Florida. It is approaching the Tampa Bay area, and it's going to continue to head off to the north with a modest low-level jet developing 1 kilometer winds of about 35 knots right now over top of this out of the southwest. And right along this warm frontal zone, there is a little bit of a area of easterly surface winds, and then to the south of it, those winds shift out of the due south. The sky's clear to the north of the warm front, a little bit of fog, stable air. Temperature up here across the northern Florida Peninsula is in the 40s right now on the stable side of that boundary. But really the boundary between the stable air to the north and the unstable air to the south, right along this warm frontal zone, any of these supercells that are able to interact with that warm frontal zone are certainly going to have a tornado threat. And this is a day ahead of the Super Bowl out here. I'm not sure if the Super Bowl is in Miami or Tampa Bay. I think it might even be in the Orlando area today. It's somewhere in Florida, I know, and so definitely people that are traveling down to the Super Bowl may already be down there. Certainly need to stay tuned to those watches and those warnings as they're issued through this evening and the overnight period. But now let's show you the Storm Prediction Center has upgraded the target area to a slight risk overnight, right along that warm frontal zone. Anticipated coverage of storms is expected to be sufficient to drop a slight risk out here, and that's the yellow area by the Storm Prediction Center, and that includes a 2% tornado probability, so there is a non-zero threat of those tornadoes, and the low-level storm relative helicity looks to be on the order of about 200, even along the warm frontal zone, and that's marginally supportive of a tornado threat, and also where you can get those low-level easterly winds overlapping with some surface-based instability right along that warm frontal boundary as it lifts. There could be some enhanced low-level wind shear where you have those easterlies and then it flips around to a southwesterly at 35 to 40 knots with that warm frontal zone. But now let's take a look at the 500 millibar Vort pattern, and this will show you the trigger mechanism for this severe weather event. And it doesn't take much down here in Florida to get surface-based convection out there. And you can see this 500 millibar map right here. This is vorticity with the red colors, the darker colors there showing greater amounts of vorticity and spin. In general, areas just ahead of a mid-level vorticity like this are associated with lift, pressure falls, southerly winds capable of transporting moisture northward. In this case, though, the Vortmax is lagging a little bit behind here in the southern plains. We also do have a subtropical connection here, suppressed subtropical jet because we do have those La Nina conditions in the Pacific, but there is just enough of a subtropical signal and an embedded jet streak within it, and also some upstream cyclonic curvature to create some general lift across this belt here across the northern Gulf of Mexico. But then when you embed a little bit of a jet streak, a little ribbon of vorticity down there, and you can certainly see it here on this 500 millibar Vort map forecast at about midday today. So this is about right now, and it shows that little Vortmax. It's very subtle, and that's why there still is marginal to a slight risk across central and northern Florida. This Vortmax, even though it is enough to excite a low-level jet, a modest low-level jet of about 40 knots, it's not a big open wave that's digging in to the Gulf of Mexico. And if that were to happen, then you'd have a much stronger low-level jet. You'd have a very rapidly northward moving warm front as well. You'd have a more predictable convective evolution as well. But oftentimes in Florida, you depend on these little subtropical disturbances to be just enough to generate some lift in the eastern Gulf of Mexico to get those supercells to come ashore. And in this case, you also have a warm front that is lifting northward across the Florida Peninsula out ahead of this ribbon of vorticity. So this ribbon of vorticity is going to be enough to generate a band of supercells across northeastern Gulf of Mexico. And right about 6 or 7 p.m., that's when they're forecast to make landfall pretty close to the Crystal River area. So now let's go to the surface map, and then we can identify where that warm frontal zone is lifting northward. We broke this down last night exclusively for the Storm Chase EDU platform, Facebook supporters, the Team Dominator support group, and we're going to resume classes every Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. We're going to break down basic meteorology. We're going to do a case study. We're going to identify storm structure as well, features in storm structure. And we're going to do that every Wednesday evening at 7 p.m., streamed exclusively live through the Facebook supporter platform. But this is the warm frontal zone here, and in general, right about in that area. To the north of the warm frontal zone, you have easterly winds. These wind barbs suggest easterly winds at about 5 to 10 knots to the north of it. Also some fog up here on the stable side of the warm front across northern Florida. There was some fog earlier in the Tampa Bay area, but you can see some clearing skies there, starting to go partly cloudy in Tampa, especially at the south of Tampa, as that warm frontal zone is about to blast through central Florida. So what happens with these warm frontal zones is they slope upward, and the warm air is coming up from the south, trying to erode the stable air, which is more dense, slides underneath that warm air. And so the warm air lifts up and over top this stable air at the low levels, creating a sloping front surface from south to north. And to the south of it, the frontal zone, you get due southerlies. The skies break out and clear. Temperatures veer to a southerly, near due southerly direction in this case. To the north, where you have that stable air at the low levels. Within that stable air at the surface, you have easterly winds. You have a low stratus deck, a lot of fog. And if you're blasting from north to south in here to try to storm chase, you definitely know when you're approaching that warm frontal zone. You can see a little ribbon of light skies on the horizon. Then the low clouds start to gradually erode, and eventually they're replaced by clear blue skies above. And here the dew points are rising into the low 70s in the central and southern Florida Peninsula to the south of that warm front. Tampa Bay, you're about to break through onto the warm side. You're in the low 70s now, dew points in the upper 60s. Just up the coast, though, in the Crystal River area, 63 over 55. You're still in the stable air, but we have 5 or 6 hours for this warm front to continue to lift, eventually reaching this zone where those supercells are forecast to make landfall right near the Crystal River area. But right now, that warm front is lifting northward through the Florida Peninsula. And one thing I noticed with the models that seems to happen is the warm front tries to get a bit of a shape like this later on. Some of the short-range models are showing this, and I think that's because of these east-northeasterly winds coming off the relatively cool Atlantic Ocean here, helping to fortify the stable air kind of in the east-central portion of the Florida Peninsula, especially the northeastern part of the Florida Peninsula as well. And as this vortex approaches the Crystal River area, it's going to lead to an enhancement in the low-level jet across the western Florida Peninsula. That's going to help to push that warm front a little bit north, and then it's going to gain that slant across the Florida Peninsula. So I could see these supercells making landfall around 6 or 7 p.m. right near sunset with waterspout and tornado potential, riding this warm front across the western side of the Florida Peninsula, and then likely crossing into this stable air as they get a little bit further east toward the Orlando areas, where that low-level stable air is fortified across the east-central Florida Peninsula, where you kind of have these northeasterly winds coming in off the relatively cooler waters of the Atlantic there this time of year. So I think we're going to see this type of a configuration evolve with that warm front as it lifts north. And then this zone right here is where that greater wind shear is going to be, right along the warm frontal zone. You're going to have the overlap of surface-based instability, enhanced low-level wind shear with those easterly low-level winds at the surface. And that's the area that I'm watching around Crystal River. I did wake up at about 5 a.m. this morning with the plan of driving down here and chasing this, but still, I think that with the coronavirus impacts to my thyroid gland, it's taken a little bit of my tenacity during this winter, but it is slowly coming back. and I do expect it to be back totally once full-blown chase mode is activated. Nevertheless, though, I'm going to do these live briefings, break down the radar through this evening as these supercells are approaching the Crystal River area to the north of Tampa Bay. And we'll break down the environment ahead of these. We'll break down the photographs as well, break down any legitimate tornado threats. And I'm also considering chasing the snow event, 3 to 6 inches of snow just to the north across the southern Appalachians as that storm system is ejecting off to the northeast. Winter storm warnings have been issued, including the Asheville area, starting at 6 p.m. tonight through noon tomorrow. Fast-moving snow event, but still could easily get several inches of snow. So now let's break down the ingredients for this severe weather event across the Florida Peninsula. This is the latest RAP analysis showing you exactly where that warm frontal zone is located. To the south of the warm frontal zone, you have an abundance of surface-based instability down here. Winds shifting to more of a southerly, southeasterly direction. To the north of that warm frontal zone, you have a lot of stable air at the low levels and a complete lack of surface-based instability. Easterly winds, even some more northeasterlies here over the eastern side of the Florida Peninsula. That's going to help to fortify that stable air and slow the northward progression of the warm front in the eastern side of the peninsula. But the warm front's going to be racing north on the western side of the peninsula, getting up to the Crystal River area, and eventually you're going to have this type of a configuration to that warm front. And the RAP model shows that pretty well. This is the analysis at midday right now. The forecast for 22Z, or about 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, shows you that surge of the warm front across the western portion of the Florida Peninsula there, right up to that developing area cluster of storms coming in off the Gulf of Mexico. And that's going to be your severe weather event right here. And really, you can extrapolate this warm frontal zone all the way out over the Gulf of Mexico. These are likely going to be surface-based supercells down here just along or just on the south side of the warm frontal zone. Could even have water spouts all the way down into the open Gulf of Mexico there. And this cluster of supercells is going to be approaching the Crystal River area. And look at how this warm front gains that pivot. You can see how it surges to the north across the western side of the Florida Peninsula. Right now it's blasting through the Tampa Bay area, heading eventually anchoring along the Crystal River area, right in that gap in the topography there in the coastline. And then this cluster of storms is going to move ashore right exactly where that warm frontal zone is located. So this is the area of greatest tornado threat that's going to happen between about 6 and 10 p.m., and it's very possible that these storms could become elevated as they slide in toward the Atlantic coastline and interact with that low-level stable air coming in off the Atlantic. It's also possible, though, that this warm front could just lift north and erode all of that stable air, and then you're just going to get some tornado producers moving across the state from west to east. 6 p.m. until midnight. Looks like that's when that threat is going to happen. But that lobe of vorticity, as we just saw in the NAM, is over the north-central Gulf of Mexico. These supercells, band of supercells is forecast to be in this location at 5 p.m. and then right at sunset, making landfall very close to the Crystal River area. The HRRR, the RAP, the NAM are all in relatively close agreement in the evolution of this pattern. And decent wind shear, even along the warm frontal zone, a nice blob there of effective storm relative felicities in the lowest kilometer of around 200, more than sufficient in the Florida Panhandle to generate a supercell and a tornado threat. And you can just see this blob of favorable low-level shear waiting ahead of this cluster of storms that's going to be coming in off the northeastern Gulf of Mexico, moving onshore near the Crystal River area there in the Gulf. That's the RAP model forecast. And the 850 winds that are generating that blob of shear accelerate right just ahead of this vortmax. So just a little bit of a ripple out here over the open Gulf of Mexico is enough to trigger this band of supercells. And then you get a little channel of a low-level jet, accelerated low-level jet near 40 knots that develops just ahead of that. So there's some enhanced low-level shear just ahead of this band of supercell storms over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. That's going to come pretty close to the Crystal River area. Low-level wind shear enhanced by the easterlies right along that surging warm frontal zone across the western Florida Peninsula, and also that accelerating low-level jet closer to sunset that's supposed to increase to near 40 knots there across the western Florida Peninsula. So here is the HRRR breaking it down, and you can see this little ripple here within the winds associated with this speed max coming in here with the subtropical connection across the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. Just a little ripple there. That's the forecast for 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, showing you that cluster of supercells over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. This is your severe weather event, and you've got the warm front that'll be lifting northward through central Florida. A couple renegade showers try to develop over that stable air being reinforced over the eastern Florida peninsula there. And this warm front's expected to settle in here near the Crystal River area, and then it's just a waiting game to wait for that cluster of storms to move across the Gulf of Mexico. This is the forecast at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time right here. You can see those supercells inching ever so closely to the western Gulf Coast. And this is the latest HRRR, but definitely, and the latest HRRR, even at 4 p.m., does show a couple renegade storms developing along that warm frontal zone here in central Florida. This is a new development with these latest, with the latest HRRR now showing the development of these renegade storms. The RAP doesn't show this, but it does show substantial instability that develops to the south of that warm frontal zone. So it's very possible that even at about 4 or 5 p.m., you could get a couple of renegade storms developing well ahead of that ribbon of vorticity here over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. At 5 p.m., it does show those renegades evolving from west-southwest to east-northeast across central Florida. By this time, though, the warm front begins to surge to the north toward the Crystal River area ahead of this cluster of supercells. This is at 5 p.m. It's still over the open Gulf of Mexico. Pretty good agreement with the RAP model on the location of these supercell storms across the northeastern Gulf of Mexico here. A couple of renegades as well on that lifting warm frontal zone in central Florida. I'm wondering, though, if these supercells in the east central part of the Florida peninsula are going to eventually become elevated as that stable air is reinforced in the east central Florida peninsula. But then this cluster of supercells by 6 p.m. is getting ever closer to the Crystal River area. And then you can see these renegades now form their own MCS all over the open waters of the Gulf Stream, some warmer waters there. The HRRR still is hinting at some renegades developing ahead of this cluster of supercell storms. Probably going to be some water spouts associated with this, especially on the southern edge of this mass of storms right near the Crystal River area. This is the forecast at 7 p.m. when these are going to start to come ashore. Could definitely see some tornado warnings, a lot of special marine warnings with these water spouts approaching the Crystal River area well to the north of Tampa Bay. Some renegades with this sloped warm frontal zone here across near the Orlando area. Could have tornado potential as well, but I'm still wondering if that stable air is going to impede anything. But then by 8 p.m., you can see some supercell storms, probably HP supercell storms. The southern edge of that convective blob is going to be where you can get surface-based tornado potential there, where it interacts with that warm frontal zone that's going to be lifting off to the north. You can definitely see that warm frontal zone there, right along the southern edge of that cluster of storms, right along Crystal River. By 8 p.m. That's exactly where that warm front is going to be situated. And look at that stable air over the eastern Florida peninsula, kind of hurting that renegade threat. Even though the HRRR fires those renegades over the central Florida peninsula back towards Tampa, to Orlando area, there is kind of a fortification here of that stable air at the low levels across the eastern Florida peninsula that really can't be ignored. And we can see it on the HRRR sounding. The forecast sounding shows it, this area of stable air at the low levels, 65 over 64, maintaining those easterly winds at the low levels there before beneath a southwesterly low-level jet at about 40 knots. But that warm front does surge to the north across the western Florida peninsula, and then you look at the sounding here, a little bit more surface-based instability there, temperatures in the low 70s. It is going to be basically a very, very shallow, stable layer there near the Crystal River area. You can see that the surface winds are less easterly, a little bit closer to that warm frontal zone, and pretty favorable photographs for a tornado threat here at that 1 kilometer wind near 40 knots Surface wind at about 7.5 knots out of the due south, creating 30 to 40 knots of 0 to 1 kilometer shear. Quite a bit of storm relative helicity, so with that, in the surface to 1 kilometer layer, that generates SRH in excess of 300 out there. So right along that warm frontal zone, you can see that you're getting even more storm relative helicity in the lowest kilometer than many of the models were showing, and the RAP is showing with that near 200 meters squared per second squared blob, but kind of greater storm relative helicity along the western edge of that blob as those supercells are coming ashore. 1 kilometer wind near 40 knots there, 4, 5, and 6 kilometer winds accelerating due to that subtropical connection there, subtropical jet. More than sufficient to evacuate rain and hail from the updrafts. And these storms are going to be moving east-northeasterly at about 35 to 40 knots across the northern and central Florida peninsula, interacting with that warm frontal zone. So that's a beautiful photograph here to generate tornado potential. I'm not sure about those renegades. We can look at the renegades here. Can kind of see that stable air over the eastern Florida peninsula, but plenty of good dew points there across the central Florida peninsula, even all the way up to the Orlando area. Definitely shows the development of these renegade supercells across the Florida peninsula. And if I do pick a sounding just to the south of those, still a pretty favorable photograph for an isolated tornado threat. Not the big looping photograph that you get later on with that mode near Crystal River with the warm front reaching it, but certainly non-zero storm relative helicity in the lowest kilometer or two. Pretty due easterly, near basically east-northeasterly storm motion at about 30 knots, and an abundance of surface-based instability out there just to the south of those renegades. Look at those steep low-level lapse rates there. Temperatures warming up into the mid-70s. Southerly winds just to the south of those. So what that tells me is that those renegade storms that develop near 4 p.m. along this warm frontal zone to the north of Tampa Bay, all the way to through the Orlando area, do have a tornado potential and during the daylight hours. And they initiate at about 4 p.m. between Tampa and Orlando up there. And then here is that main vortex over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. Confidence is not as high in the initiation of these renegade storms. These have just appeared in the last couple runs of the HRRR. You can also see this MCS out over the open Atlantic there to the east of it. Interesting. And even by 4 p.m., though, you can see this slope to the warm frontal zone as depicted by the HRRR with kind of a fortification of the low-level stable air over Cape Canaveral areas down to the south. The warm front does lift north of the Palm Beach area. It already has, according to the surface map, well north of the Tampa Bay area. And so the models do show initiation right along this warm frontal zone, but it's possible those could be slightly elevated over this stable air, this little wedge of stable air here over the eastern Florida peninsula. And then you get the instability axis surging from south to north across the western Florida peninsula, even by 4 p.m., getting pretty close to Crystal River by 4 p.m. even. And Cape values 1,500 easy to the south of that, maybe even greater than that, approaching the 2,000 mark. Plenty of low-level Cape as well, even more robust. Look at all that low-level Cape right along that warm frontal zone. And this is certainly sufficient to generate a supercell storm. You can see this little hole in the Cape there. That's one of those renegades that attempts to develop along this warm frontal zone. So really, the tornado threat, you need to start watching at about 3 or 4 p.m. here from Tampa Bay through Orlando. And then the threat by 6, 7, 8 p.m. shifts to this main band of supercells that'll be coming in off the northeastern Gulf, making landfall near the Crystal River area as well. Let's look at another forecast sounding here just south of Crystal River, showing these incredibly steep low-level lapse rates. Temperature warms into the upper 70s according to this, and that's why you have so much 3-kilometer Cape there, because of these very steep low-level lapse rates. It's February out here, northern Florida, dew points in the mid-60s here, and quite a favorable photograph for a tornado threat, even before that low-level jet ramps up. This is at about 4 p.m. 2 hours after this, when that band of supercells is approaching, that ribbon of a low-level jet out ahead of him accelerates up to above 40 knots there, making that hodograph much larger, much more looping, increasing the storm relative helicity above 300 out there. So an already favorable hodograph becomes more favorable as you go from 4 p.m. until about 6 to 7 p.m. Here. The storm motion also accelerates, and then so a couple different modes of convection appear possible. Also, you can't ignore this critical angle, just basically exactly 90 degrees. That's the angle of the storm motion vector versus the 0 to 1 kilometer shear vector at 90 degrees. That's the most favorable critical angle there for ingestion of streamwise vorticity into these supercell storms. So a pretty favorable environment. A couple of modes. There could be these renegade storms that develop at about 4 p.m. along this warm frontal zone, central Florida, back toward Tampa Bay area. And then about 6 or 7 p.m., this main cluster of storms approaches the Crystal River area, and then that moves across from west to east across the Florida Peninsula. And even overnight tonight, between about 9 p.m. and midnight, I wouldn't be surprised if this warm frontal zone attains a more west to east-oriented shape, and you kind of get an erosion of this wedge of stable air there across the east central Florida Peninsula. So that's what I have today for this severe weather threat. Again, there is some winter storm warnings that are out already from the southern Appalachians, even far northwestern South Carolina, just up the road by about 10 miles, expecting 4 inches of snow tonight. That winter storm warning goes into effect at 6 p.m. I may head up there before sunrise tomorrow to get some of those shots up near Pretty Place. But I do plan on going live this evening as this tornado threat develops. It could be as early as 4, 5, 6 p.m. out there when I start my radar breakdowns. Definitely be sure to stay tuned. And I'm going to be going live on all social media platforms, Facebook, YouTube, probably some Twitch as well later on this evening. For the Super Bowl, I did take TB12 and the Tampa Bay Bucks. Of course, I've been picking Tom Brady for 20 years. But during my break-even sports handicapping career, taking Tom Brady again, and the over as well. So there's a chance that he could lose and still break even as well. I just feel like his immense preparation is unmatched. He's probably adjusting his diet ahead of facing defensive coordinator Spagnuolo there, where he has a 2-4 record against him. I just think his preparation is unmatched. The Bucks probably haven't even opened the playbook most of the year, got in the playoffs, got to the Super Bowl, and now I think we're going to see an opening of that playbook tomorrow. But first, we got to get over this tornado threat down in Florida with this warm front lifting from south to north, eventually settling near the Crystal River area, and a band of supercells approaching Crystal River, and renegades that could develop across the central Florida Peninsula as early as 4 p.m. from about Tampa Bay to the Orlando area. So thank you guys for tuning into my weather reports this Saturday. Hope you enjoyed them, and be sure to check out the Facebook supporter community. That's where we're going to do Storm Chase EDU content as well, starting every Wednesday evening at 7 p.m., breaking down the basics in meteorology, storm structure, case studies. Every week we're going to continue to try to expand our collective meteorological knowledge. Down the road, probably even have some guest lectures. But thank you, everybody, for joining me for these weather reports. I definitely enjoy doing them, enjoy discussing weather, breaking down radar forecasts from a storm chaser's perspective. And I look forward to broadcasting live as this tornado threat evolves with the renegades at about 4 or 5 p.m., and then this main batch of supercells coming in right about sunset and extending through midnight across the central and northern Florida Peninsula. So thank you, everybody. Never stop chasing.